He walked in, smiling, carrying suitcases and someone else's laughter. And by midnight, I had the house sold. They looked like a family coming to stay, bright faces, a pile of jackets, a new rhythm that didn't belong to my home. For a moment, I stood frozen in the doorway, watching him move through my kitchen like he owned the air. I remember thinking absurdly that he'd forgotten to take off his coat. Then I saw the shoes by the door. Not mine, not his, a pair lined up like a flag planted in my life. And the scent of stale cologne that clung to his coat like an accusation. It's a short story with a loud heartbeat, betrayal, a quiet plan, and the clean, cold snap of a decision. I could have screamed, I could have begged. Instead, I made a choice that would make them speak about me differently. Not with whispers of pity, but with a stunned, embarrassed silence. The house remembers everything. It remembers the first shallow cup of coffee we shared after a late night. The dent in the banister where our child learned to slide down instead of climb, the faint pencil marks on the pantry door from years of birthdays tallied. That house was our promise, mortar and habit and mornings. And the truth is this, when a person walks back into a life carrying someone else's laughter, some promises are already broken. I wasn't interested in breaking him. I was interested in reclaiming myself. This isn't a story about violence. It's about being seen, being clever, and taking back what they thought they could take. I stood very still and watched the new woman arrange cushions on my sofa as if she'd lived there forever. Upstairs, children's chatter, my children's, rose like a soundtrack to the scene, unaware. My hands found the pile of mail on the counter without my thinking about it. I thumbed through envelopes like someone flipping pages of a book that suddenly made no sense. If you've ever been backstabbed by those closest to you and fantasized about the perfect revenge, like subscribe and comment your own story below, this one's going to hit hard. There was a small, official-looking envelope near the bottom, the kind you ignore until it isn't ignorable. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I unfolded it with the slow care of someone who knows a life can change on a single line of paper. But it wasn't until I opened the mail that night that everything changed. I used to judge a morning by whether his socks were on the floor or in the hamper. Mornings lived in small certainties. The whine of the kettle, the soft scrape of a spoon against a chipped mug, the porch swing complaining on its ropes when a child leapt off too quickly. I learned the exact minute the light would find the kitchen table, golden and forgiving through the thin curtains, and timed the toast so it would be ready right as the house woke. There was a rhythm to our life here, a careful choreography of small tasks that made everything feel safe. Coffee steam clouded the air and, if you listened, you could hear the house exhale along with us. I can still name the smell of every room. The living room carried the faint sweetness of lemon oil from the wooden floor cleaner I used on Sundays. The hallway smelled of backpacks and yesterday's rain. Upstairs, the bedrooms kept a lingering perfume of bedtime stories and cotton clothing folded just so. You could walk through the house and read our years like a book. Crayon marks on the pantry door from when the boys learned to count. A faint pencil line behind the bedroom door marking the children's heights, the way the numbers had climbed with us. The dent in the banister where our daughter skidded down when she was 3 and thought she was flying. We bought this house like you buy a promise. Late one night, after a long shift and half a bottle of wine, he and I sat at this very table and sketched out numbers. The interest rates were higher than either of us liked. The realtor had praised the neighborhood, good schools, quiet streets, and we liked her optimism. We took our small savings and threw them together. We signed papers with hands that trembled, not from fear but from the dizzying sense that we were committing to something larger than ourselves. When we fitted the key into the front door for the first time, we both laughed like children. We painted a wall the first weekend, arguing over whether to call it ocean or morning fog, and the argument ended with him stepping back, admiring, and saying the sort of thing that made me keep him. It feels like ours. That word, ours, folded into everything. The mortgage became not just a line in a bank ledger, but a daily ritual. The Post-it note on the fridge reminding us to transfer funds, the way we counted down vacations around bills, the the quiet pride when we had a little extra left over at month's end. The house became evidence that we could make a future. It held birthdays in its closets and scraped knees in its laundry basket. It held the first nights where the baby cried and the two of us took turns, eyes red and hopeful, whispering that we were doing the right thing. He was charming when he turned on that charm. He could make the world glow with one sideways smile. He was also forgetful in ways I learned to forgive. The odd late meeting, the longer phone calls that bled into the time he said he would be home. Those calls we called work, and I believed them because you have to believe until you have proof otherwise. There was no drama at first. There were small contradictions, an unexplained receipt from a restaurant I didn't recognize, a lipstick on a glass stem that wasn't mine, and I smoothed them over with jokes or explanations. "You're overthinking," he would say, touching my shoulder with that practiced tenderness. "It's just a trip. Seriously, stop spiraling." I would laugh because the alternative was to ask too many questions and to watch the trust between us strain under the weight of them. Our children made the house sing. The boys left a trail of comic books in every room, sticky notes with "Do not enter" scrawled across their bedroom doors, and half-finished Lego empires on the coffee table. Their mornings were a parade of small rituals, cereal boxes counted like small economies, shoelaces tied with clumsy determination, the urgent, whispered request for one more story before the bus came. Even on the days when the world felt like it was pressing in, their laughter was the constant hum that cut through it. We had routines that felt trivial and sacred in equal measure. Sunday pancakes, the way he'd pretend to be outraged when I beat him flipping pancakes. The weekly movie night where someone always fell asleep halfway through and left a pale footprint of a shoulder on the couch. There were arguments, too, ordinary ones, about whether to repaint the fence or save for a new van. But we always returned to the small sameness of us, shared mail on the counter, matching mugs in the cupboard, a comfort in knowing where each piece belonged. So when the small things started to tilt, I told myself stories. My brain is good at making sense of unevenness. A canceled dinner became work overload. A new perfume in the coat closet became a gift from a client. And the small messages I noticed on his phone, a contact name I didn't know, became a mystery to be solved in time rather than a debt to collect immediately. He was good at apologizing in ways that felt like absolution. A bouquet left in the doorway, a long embrace just before bed, a sudden hug that smelled like his shampoo and made the world easy again. I forgave as if I had a duty to keep the house's gentle equilibrium. There were moments that now, I see them, should have been louder alarms. The first time I found a lipstick smear on a dinner plate, I convinced myself it belonged to a guest who'd stayed on a sleepover. The time he missed the school play for a meeting, I told myself that sometimes work calls. The receipts. The receipts are what you notice if you're paying attention. A hotel charge in a city he hadn't mentioned visiting. A late-night cab ride that added up in ways that made my stomach drop. I put the receipts in a drawer. I told myself I was making a mountain out of a molehill. My mother used to say, "You can't untie a knot by tugging harder. You need to find the first loop." I tell myself that now because it's kinder than admitting I didn't pull at that loop when I should have. There was a voicemail once, one I heard only because the phone slipped and he left it open. A laugh on the message that wasn't mine. A name I didn't recognize. My first impulse was to confront him. My second, the one I chose, was quieter. I saved the message to the phone, set it aside like a puzzle piece, and told myself I would look at it when it didn't sting so much. He left for a trip with a kiss that morning, like any other. Brief, precise, full of the practiced tenderness that keeps people from asking too many questions. The kids pressed on his legs for one more hug. He ruffled their hair and promised to bring back a small toy he said he'd found at a vendor in the city. He held me a little longer than usual, a touch that made me think maybe he felt the same tremor I had felt walking around the house that week. "Text me a picture of the kids at the bus stop," he said, bending to kiss my forehead. "I'll call tonight." When the car pulled away, I stood at the window until the taillights vanished around the corner. I went back through the house afterward like someone tidying up before a storm. I straightened throw pillows, stacked yesterday's mail in neat piles, wiped a sticky handprint from the counter. There's a kind of magic in small tasks. You can make a life feel less fragile by smoothing a wrinkle, tucking a blanket perfectly so the couch looks untouched. I made tea and set the pot where I liked it, listening to the house settle into itself. It was the ordinary things that comforted me. I walked down the hallway and ran my fingers over the pencil marks on the pantry door. There was the tiniest smudge where the oldest had leaned and scratched his name. Below it, new numbers in darker pencil traced the growing height of the youngest. I smiled. We were still making our way up the door 1 centimeter at a time, but there were tiny intrusions too, things that started to feel like static on a radio. A text he'd left unanswered on the kitchen counter that said, "Call me when you can. Important." A receipt with a strange restaurant name tucked into a magazine. I told myself he would explain. I told myself again the words I had always used. "You're overthinking. It's just a trip." We are very good at choosing the stories that let us keep breathing. That afternoon, before dinner, I walked through our photo albums. Faces and pixels smiled up at me. Weddings, graduations, the day we moved in, a messy cake with frosting on everyone's nose. I ran my thumb across the glossy paper, and for a while, I could imagine the life continuing exactly as it had been. The house hummed with memory, reassuring me that the next chapter would be merely another page turned. At dusk, I baked a pie, the smell of cinnamon and sugar filling the house in a way that made everything feel like a promise kept. The boys came home and flung themselves across the couch with the casual entitlement of the well-loved. We ate and argued about whose turn it was to take out the trash. The couch was full, the television played in a soft bubble, and for a moment, the day's small anxieties dissolved into dinner conversation. That night, I packed my husband's lunch for the trip the way I always did. A sandwich, wrapped in wax paper, a thermos of coffee, a note tucked inside that said, "Come home safe." I found the note oddly heavy in my hand. I folded it twice and slid it into his coat pocket, the way I had done 100 times before. Habit makes courage feel ordinary. He kissed me at the door, a quick peck, and said, "I'll be back before you know it." His voice was confident. He shrugged into his jacket, and for a second his profile against the porch light looked like someone I recognized wholly. The kids waved in their pajamas, a small, bright chorus, and I forced my mouth into a smile that I hoped looked enough like steadiness to reassure them. When the car pulled away, I stood at the window again. The street was the same. Quiet houses, a strip of newspaper tangled near the curb, a lamppost buzzing softly. I watched until the taillights disappeared around the bend and then returned inside, closing the door with the soft click that sounds ordinary until it echoes. I went to bed that night thinking of nothing more than the bus schedule for the morning and whether the washing machine would finish in time. I fell asleep to the sound of the house breathing, safe in the knowledge that promises, even if fragile, had been made and would be kept. In the morning, the house greeted me with its familiar smells and the sound of the kettle beginning to sing. I moved through the rituals with the ease of someone who had practiced them for years. I made coffee. I checked the mail. I folded a laundry basket. The world hummed on the frequency I had tuned it to, and I assumed everything was as it had always been. I waved. I didn't yet know I was waving goodbye to the life I thought I had. The car door clicked and a noise like a soft foreign laugh filled the yard before I even saw them. For a second the sound felt like a wrong note in a song I'd known all my life. High, bright, certain it belonged somewhere else. Then the door opened and the world shifted. There was perfume first. Not the faint, familiar scent of his cologne that had lived in the coat closet for years, but something sweeter and sharper, a clean floral that stung the back of my throat. It sat in the air like a new language I couldn't translate. Behind it came a cluster of voices, laughter that did not curve around my name, conversations that did not hold the cadence of our family jokes. They moved through the yard like they had an appointment here, like this house had been waiting. He stepped out, smiling. He smiled the way he used to when he wanted me to forget something. The woman with him moved with the casual confidence of someone taking a place already set for them. She had a laugh that arrived early and shoes lined up at the bottom of my steps that looked too deliberate to be accidental. Behind her were others, an aunt, a teenage cousin, a boy with a backpack slung over one shoulder. Faces unfamiliar and oddly comfortable in the way strangers sometimes are when they travel together. They spilled into my hallway like music from a different radio. My feet felt heavy. My tongue felt thick. The kids were mid-sentence on the couch, remote on the arm, bowl of cereal cooling on the coffee table. One of them pointed at the door and blinked. "Who's that, Mom?" he asked, as if the correct answer could be handed to him with a smile. My voice did not come out right away. I watched them from where I stood in the doorway, steady as a statue, like a face on a coin. He tried the quick laugh that had soothed many small domestic storms. "Surprise," he said, and for a moment the word was almost light again, like a balloon someone had let go of and then caught. Then the laughter shifted and the balloon popped. I heard myself speak before I knew I would. The question fell like a stone. "Who are they?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the woman, at the relatives, at the kids on the couch, and then back at me. The answer came like a practiced shrug. "It's complicated." "It's complicated." He said it as if the phrase could smooth the wrinkle in the day, as if complexity could be folded away and set on the kitchen table like the mail. "Complicated doesn't live in my house," I said. The words were small, but they had weight. They landed on the hardwood and echoed. There were whispers from beyond the threshold. A neighbor who had come over to borrow sugar and seen the scene unfold. A cautious wave from the woman across the street, her face suddenly a little too interested. Faces turned at the window. The porch light looked like a spotlight. There is a particular kind of humiliation that arrives not from a single act, but from the way a private thing becomes public. The children's sharp, uncertain questions were nothing compared to the slow, uncomfortable turning of heads on my block. I felt the neighborhood watching me like a mirror with its gloss slightly cracked. The woman smiled at me the way people do when they believe they have right on their side. She leaned into the room and made a throw of an easy comment. We were in the area and thought we'd stop by. Her voice was bright, practiced, the phrase like a key someone had been waiting to use. She sat on my sofa and tucked her shoes beneath her as if they were home. Inside, my stomach turned. A film seemed to settle on everything. The cushions, the framed photographs on the wall, the small ceramic angel on the mantel that had watched over birthdays and broken arms. The house exhaled, and I felt its memories rearranging themselves around this new shape. The salt of a past argument, the faint mustard stain from a picnic long ago, tile warmed by 1,000 feet, all of it suddenly had a new volume, an altered context. He tried to explain. He offered up little phrases. Their family. It was unexpected. They needed a place to stay. His hands moved in ways that had once convinced me of sincerity. Gestures elbowed out reasons. I listened and watched for the old familiarity to come back. That small, convincing choreography he did when he wanted a mistake to look like a misstep. Outside, the neighbor's car idled too long. She craned her neck to see in the window and then darted a look as if she'd seen too much. Rumors are creatures that thrum on the edges. They feed on what you leave uncovered. I felt the prying begin to gather like dust. One of the boys, mine, but looking suddenly small and old in the same breath, asked the woman if she would play a game. He said it like a lifeline. She looked at him with a smile that did not reach her eyes and said, "Maybe later," as if postponement was a kindness. That small deferral hit me like a slap. A child's invitation should not be polite enough to be refused. My hands were cold. I reached automatically for the things that carried proof of our life, a photo on the mantel, an old receipt from the summer festival, the tiny blue trophy the youngest had won at soccer. My fingers brushed the frame and I felt an urgency like a current. I wanted to uproot them from the living room and plant them somewhere safe, but the room seemed larger now, too full, as if my gestures would be swallowed. He moved through my home like a man carrying permission. He laughed at a joke that belonged to someone else now. He introduced the woman. "This is Mara," he said, with that soft, comfortable cadence that had taught me to fall in step. He put an arm around her in a way that had been reserved for me, an old language of touch repurposed. The familiarity on his face while he spoke her name felt like a betrayal performed in slow, careless strokes. The new woman's comment came later, offhand, and it should have been a small thing. She mentioned a photo on the wall, a picture of me and him on our first anniversary, and said, with the thoughtlessness of someone looking at a museum piece, "You two look so nice together. It's a shame things change." The phrasing was clinical, like an observation from a visitor reading the plaques. It was her voice in the house, casual and precise, that cut the deepest. It was the small cruelty of her assuming the past. Our past. As something already packaged and sealed. Humiliation burned, slow and bright. It spread outward, an infection that made everything ache. I felt the weight of small-town eyes on the rest of my life. I felt the rearrangement of plans that had been built on an unspoken faith. There was a sick sort of theater in which I had become an audience to my own undoing. After they settled, after the polite small talk and the strained laughter, I took one step that felt necessary and dangerous at the same time. I walked over to his phone. I moved with the quietness of someone performing a ritual she had never expected to need. There is a particular hush in the tapping of a screen, like the soft whisper of pages turning. The phone was on the counter, face up, a man-made altar of secrets. My hands did not tremble at first. I told myself I would be objective. I would look for nothing and accept whatever, even an explanation sound, with the calm of someone who trusted the truth to make itself plain. That is what I told myself. Then my thumb, with a gravity I did not own that morning, unlocked the phone with the code he had given me years ago when we first promised to share everything. The messages were a scatter at first. Mundane conversations, jokes, photos of food. And then I found a thread that smelled of proof, images loaded coldly on the screen. Him and the woman in a cafe, their faces close, a photograph from a hotel balcony with a name I recognized from a receipt I'd once found. A message that read like a map of infidelity. There were dates, times, small notes that were intimate enough to be unmistakable. The screen was bright and clinical, indifferent to the chaos it revealed. I pressed the thread and my stomach flipped. The tremble I had managed to resist finally came, small and hard, and my fingers shook as if I were holding a bird that would scatter. The evidence was not dramatic. No shouting, no crashing scenes. But it was irrefutable. There were reservations, notes about plans. There was the candid affection of a man who had chosen to take the shape of his attention somewhere else. The house around me became a room of echoes. The laughter that had come in with them now seemed layered, recorded, and replayed to mock me. Paper in my hand, an old receipt, looked suddenly traitorous. The mantel photos appeared as if behind a glass, their faces halos I could no longer touch. The kids were still there, their eyes bright and confusing, and the simplest things in the room assumed a new, sharper meaning. I could have confronted him then. I could have lifted my voice and let the neighbors hear the thing that had been secret. I could have turned the house into a theater of accusation, performed my grief for all the porches to see. Instead, a curious clarity settled in. It was not the flaring, hot clarity of immediate wrath. It was the cool, precise clarity of someone who has cataloged the damage and decided how to respond. I felt a shift in my chest. A small, hard thing like a coin turned over. The disbelief that had carved a hollow in me folded into anger. The anger was quiet at first, a planning anger, the kind that did not need theatrics. It reached into my bones and made a contract with my will. I thought of the years of small kindnesses and the way trust had been sipped away, teaspoon by teaspoon. I thought of the mortgage notices, the paint I'd scraped away from the sill, the late-night homework sessions. I thought of the way our life had been built on mutual care and how suddenly that scaffolding felt thin. I realized, in a way that was clinical and not melodramatic, that pleading would not restore those years. Screaming would not rewrite the months logged in messages and receipts. What might make a difference was an action that matched the scale of the betrayal, something undeniable, measured, and irreversible enough to realign the ledger. It did not require spectacle. It required strategy. My mind began to make lists as if that would anchor me. What could be done? Who held the papers? Which accounts were jointly held? Which documents were in my name? There were ordinary bureaucratic things that suddenly read like tools. A deed, a mortgage statement, an old email from the realtor, the login to an online account. My head buzzed, not with the ache of loss, but with a geometry of options. For the first time in hours, the possibility of motion, of doing something practical, felt like relief. I let them talk for a while. I let him say the things that might someday pass for an explanation. I let the new woman talk about the city, about a cousin's graduation, about the way the light fell on my porch. I let the kids ask about cookies. I moved through the room carefully, like an inspector taking note of each piece before making a decision. When the neighbor left, the sugar borrowed and the eyes gone, I watched them go with a kind of interest I had not felt since before the wall of betrayal slid between us. The house contracted again around its center like a muscle returning to rest. I went to the sink and washed my hands, as if the water might cleanse the grime of the morning. There was a hardness in me that surprised me. It felt less like fury and more like a sharpening. I did not want to be the spectacle. I did not want to be the one who begged. I wanted to be the one who reclaimed. My anger was lined with a surprising compassion for myself, for the children who did not need a house that made them feel smaller, and even for him in some strange corner that still liked the memory of what we had been. The decision settled without fanfare. It was a small sentence in my mind, but it sounded like a bell. I will not be erased. I will not be left to collect the crumbs of what we had. I would not allow the life we built to be folded into someone else's suitcase. I could have stayed and begged. Instead, I went upstairs and packed one small bag. The house was a hollow drum after they left, the kind of silence that makes your own breath sound loud. The kids slept in the next room, their chests rising and falling, and the ordinary noises that used to stitch the day together had dissolved into a raw, empty echo. I walked the hallways like someone testing the acoustics of a chapel. My footsteps answered me, small and surprised. The photos on the wall looked like press clippings, faces frozen in better times, mouths smiling politely for the record. The echo made even the smallest sound feel theatrical. Paper rustled in the kitchen like a secret being turned over. That afternoon, the phone didn't stop. Friends called in a pattern, concern, curiosity, the kind of gentleness that sits on the line before questions land. "Are you okay?" became a chorus. My sister left a voicemail that hummed with protection. Neighbors texted in the careful language of people who want to help but are afraid of making things worse. The landlord, a man who usually only appeared for rent inspections, called with a voice that tried to be casual. Rumors gather quickly. Gossip is fast and greedy in small neighborhoods. I could feel them, like a weather front, creasing the day. I tried to keep the rhythm of the house because it felt like fraud to do anything else. I made sandwiches for the boys the way I always had, wrapping them in wax paper and pressing the edges with the flat of my palm. I set the plates on the table. I put a kettle on the stove. The kettle sang a small, familiar song, and I sat very still until the whistle died. In those hours, I found myself moving through the motions like a trained actor. Each gesture was an anchor. Each small task kept me from sliding into something sharp. Night was worse. That is when the denial arrived like a tide. It was easy to convince myself in the dark that the morning would erase the strange new architecture of our life. I lay awake cataloging feelings in the way one catalogs travel plans. Seat 14A, leave at dusk, bring a sweater. Denial was orderly. Denial told me stories. He's overwhelmed, it's a misunderstanding, it will be fixed. Bargaining came next. I rewound conversations in my head, imagining different replies I might have made. Witty things I might have said that would have turned him back. Anger came after that, sudden and hot as a slap. Grief arrived like a worn coat I could not take off. I kept it on, even when it no longer fit. My nights narrowed into a pattern, crying until the pillow absorbed the morning, then getting up and making a plan to be practical. I cried so quietly, some nights the house didn't register it. Other nights I cried with a sound like breaking. Tears blurred the world into watercolor edges, and then I would rise and clean the counter as if the act of wiping could mend a lifetime. I learned to be both the mourner and the caretaker. I found a fierce, stubborn hope in the small domestic acts. Fold the laundry, sweep the floor, make the beds again. He did not make it easier. He became someone who could explain pain away with the tilt of a shoulder. When I asked questions, he offered economy of words and a practiced gentleness that felt like grease on a hinge. If I grew angry, he called it theatrics. "You're making a scene," he said once, like a single-sentence diagnosis. The implication hung there. Emotion is spectacle. I was over the top. I remember the way his jaw set, the automatic tightening that had once meant resolve and now felt like a wall. But the story he told in public began to change. At a school function, he walked in with the new woman on his arm and introduced her as a family friend. That introduction had the casual cruelty of a person reassigning history. He began to make arrangements where my name was an afterthought. Passwords changed. Invitations arrived addressed to him and an unfamiliar surname. I found an email confirming a new card had been issued in his name only. It is a small indignity, the metallic spinning sound of bank cards falling into a new slot. The cold clang of a card hitting the counter felt like a tiny execution of my role. There were microslights that accumulated like grit. He would laugh easily around her. He began to call more often, short conversations that ended abruptly. He would leave the TV on when he left a room, deliberately. He switched accounts. He changed our family calendar. He removed my name from certain memberships with the kind of administrative care someone takes arranging furniture. Slide this, tuck that. Each act was a quiet erasure. Each removal was a pinch. You don't notice the blind taken down one notch until the room is dim. One afternoon, between school pickups, a neighbor, the one who waters my plants when I'm away, stopped by with a tray. She had a look on her face like someone carrying bad news in a pretty wrapping. She spoke in whispers, and in that small sharing, I felt my public life and private life fold together in a way I hadn't wanted. She said she'd seen him at the market with the new woman. She said she'd seen them at the cafe where couples met. She said she was sorry. The boys asked questions I was not ready for. "Is he coming back?" one asked. The syllables dipped in small hope. "Are you okay, Mama?" asked the other, as if care was a transaction they could balance with words. I answered them with the careful precision of someone who knows their children need clear edges to lean on. "Yes," I said. "Yes, I am okay." I sounded like a recording, steady, unflappable, human enough to keep them calm, but inside, the ledger of life was tallying losses in quiet columns. There were financial drafts I hadn't seen coming. An unexpectedly large bill arrived with a notation that made my stomach drop. A late fee from a lender we'd always paid on time. The explanation, printed in that bland official font, hinted at missed payments that had been logged without my knowledge. I opened the mailbox one afternoon and felt the air leave me when I saw the notice with its red stamp. The house, the object of our mutual vows, suddenly looked vulnerable in the same way a person looks vulnerable when their defenses are down. Tender, exposed. I spent hours at the kitchen table with receipts spread like a map. The smell of old paper rose up, a scent I always associated with small domestic victories. Receipts from a hardware store where I'd bought paint, a grocery list from last month, a cafeteria ticket. The smell of the receipts now tasted like danger. My hands sifted through bank statements and scanned accounts. There were charges in his name that suggested an alternate life, yes, but there were also administrative notes that placed the house in a legal limbo. Whoever had been doing the paperwork had been efficient. Whoever had been changing accounts had been quiet. The discovery of an official-looking letter changed the tenor of panic into a colder, more practical fear. It was a notice from a mortgage servicer about documents needed to clarify ownership. Nothing inhuman at first glance, but the tone suggested urgency. I read the lines over and over until the words lost their meaning and then regained it with a clarity that made my stomach empty. There was a risk, however small, of the house's status being questioned in the event of contested claims. The paper in my hand suddenly felt like a legal fulcrum, small, ordinary, and capable of moving weight. I sat back and watched the house around me like someone watching a painting of their life being altered stroke by stroke. The boys' sneakers sat by the door. A sticker on the window reminded me of a dental appointment. The tea kettle hummed in the background like a metronome. I felt all these ordinary things as if they were set on a chessboard, pieces to be considered. If the structure that sheltered us, the mortgage, the deed, the shared accounts, could be shifted by administrative gestures, then this was not merely a betrayal of love, but of livelihood. He began to gaslight in more refined ways. If I asked a pointed question, he would tilt his head and say, "You're inventing a drama." If I brought up a missing conversation, he would insist I'd imagined the words. He turned facts into fog. In conversations with his friends, he would smile and say, "We're working through some things," like an apology pre-packaged for public consumption. When I corrected him in front of others, he'd say I was embarrassing him. He reframed my insistence as irrationality. He recast wounds as performance. One evening, at a community fundraiser where we had volunteered for years, he introduced the new woman to a circle of people who had known us for a decade. He used a tone I recognized only too well, a tone that softens criticism and nudges listeners toward acceptance. She fit easily into the anecdotes. She complimented a pie that had been in our family recipe for years. People smiled and nodded. I felt like a painting hung in a salon, acknowledged but not included. A few polite questions were directed at me about my own life, and I answered, "Busy," I said, "family things." It felt like a threadbare answer, and it sounded like one. That night I came home and found an email alert that made the world tilt further. It wasn't dramatic. There was no litigation, no physical eviction notice. But there was an administrative update. The utility account had been switched in name to him alone. The small print said changes could be made with online verification. It was the clack of keys becoming one-sided. The smell of metal on bank cards echoed again in my head. Each little removal had a sound. I remember the exact moment I felt the breaking inside. I was standing at the sink, the water running over my hands like a slow apology. The boys were building a fort in their room, laughter muffled like a radio under a blanket. I checked the mail and found another official-looking envelope. The paper inside had a formal header and my name printed as an afterthought in a list of recipients. It was a typed affidavit that suggested a signature would be required to acknowledge receipt of certain documents regarding property rights. The language was legal and dry. It was written in a way that made consequences feel inevitable. I think what broke me was not the content so much as the intent. To see the paper there, a stranger's hand rearranging the scaffolding of our life, felt like watching someone pick locks with practiced, quiet fingers. The life we had built, the small rituals and the late-night whispers were suddenly negotiable items on a ledger. The idea that what I had loved might be transferred like a file in an email sent a cold through my marrow. I sat down and let myself feel everything in order. Denial first, then bargaining. What if I had asked more, noticed sooner, been less trusting? Then anger, which was not an animal, but a plan taking shape. The anger in me grew not as a theater of shouts, but as a clarity of purpose. I thought of the long lists of small kindnesses I had given this house, the nights I had stayed up with a feverish child, the evenings I had made sure the bills were paid, the mornings I had scrubbed the sink until it gleamed. I thought of the ways I had put my name on the world and how easily someone had tried to unwrite it. There were options, lawyers, confrontation, moving out, calling my family and hiding like an emergency. Each option had costs. Each cost involved the boys and their sense of security. I thought of the pain of dragging them into a public courtroom. I thought of the humiliation of being seen in the slow-motion unweaving of our life. I wanted an action that would be swift, and certain, and that would place the choice back in my hands. And then, without fireworks, the plan whispered itself into existence. It felt like a small, stubborn answer to a question no one else had asked. What if I didn't have to beg or plead or publicize my grief? What if I could convert the thing they thought they could take and use it to build my new life? I could sell the house. Sell the house. The phrase was practical. The phrase was revolutionary. I paused, letting the words settle. Selling the house would be an erasure of the physical memory, yes, but it would be an assertion of agency. It would be taking the object of their presumed entitlement and turning it into a resource that I controlled. No courtroom, no spectacle, no late-night pleas at the kitchen table. It was strategy. I began to think through the logistics with the same methodical clarity I used to manage grocery lists and school schedules. Who held the deed? Were both our names on it? Whose name was on the mortgage? Which accounts were jointly held? There were practical questions, and then there were the emotional ones. Could I watch buyers walk through these rooms and choose them? Could I box up the memories and walk away? The answer came back like a small, fierce yes. I would sell the house, and I would leave on my terms. I put a pen to a legal pad and wrote, in the slow, decisive scrawl I used for grocery lists and to-do items, 2 words, for sale, as is. They thought I would panic. They forgot I can read numbers. That sentence sat in my head like a small lit fuse the morning after I decided to sell. It wasn't bravado, it was inventory. It was the ledger of a life I had quietly kept for years. Receipts in the junk drawer. A binder of warranties under the sink. Emails with subject lines like closing documents and mortgage schedule. When the world tilts, what steadies you is often what you've been quietly collecting. Paper, dates, names, signatures. I had them all. I started the plan the way I always start difficult things, with light and a list. Late at night, I would sit at the kitchen table with the laptop glow painting the rim of my face, and a legal pad open to a blank page. The clack of keys was the only sound besides the kettle cooling on the stove. I made headings in neat columns: ownership, mortgage, utilities, contacts. Under each heading, I wrote small, actionable bullets. Find deed, check names on mortgage, call realtor, discreet, scan all paperwork. The list calmed me because it converted rage into work. It turned the private, unbearable ache into something with steps. Research was a quiet, obsessive thing. I read forums where people wrote about selling under pressure, blogs that inhaled the language of realtors and exhaled plain sense. I spent evenings on the county website, learning about deeds and recordings, and then I shut the laptop and felt the dizzying human part of it. This house had been our life, and it would now be a lever. I called a realtor I trusted, a woman from church who sold houses without fanfare and who had a reputation for discretion. Her voice on the phone was careful. We arranged to meet in the coffee shop that smelled like ground caramel, not at our house. The coffee steamed between us while she listened and nodded and then said, without judgment, "You can move fast if you want. There are options." Hands shaking a little, I gathered documents. The deed was in the old box on the top shelf of the hall closet, wrapped in tissue paper like something fragile. The mortgage statements were in a file folder labeled in my handwriting. Mortgage 2014. There were utility bills, tax papers, a small pile of old bank statements that showed both our names. I photographed pages with my phone and backed them up to a cloud drive under a secure password. Small digital prayers. I learned the difference between a joint tenancy and tenancy in common. I learned where the county recorded a deed. I learned the arcane language of title companies that sounds like law but is really just a series of gates that open for people who know the right knock. There was a moment when strategy felt almost indulgent. I found myself repainting the scuffed hallway in the thin hour between supper and bedtime. A tiny imperfection became a mission. Sand that nick, fill the groove, and a single coat of a neutral color to make the hall read warmer in photos. It was absurd and perfect. I cleaned the oven until the inside reflected my face. I polished the brass on the banister until it trimmed light like a ribbon. Each small domestic act was both nostalgia and armor. When the realtor came to take photos, the house looked like the promise it could become. The living room breathed. The bedroom looked like a restful space instead of a battlefield. I staged it modestly. Neat throw pillows, a vase with a single sprig of eucalyptus, the stack of children's books tied with twine. I did not want someone to gawk at our life or dissect our pain. I wanted the rooms to be seen as neutral ground, as something marketable, not as a spectacle. Emotionally, I cultivated the same restraint. I practiced small scripts I would use if anyone asked too many questions. We're making some changes, just handling things privately. We appreciate the concern. My voice sounded steady to my ears because I had to make it steady for the children. The boys noticed only that the house smelled different, a clean smell that wasn't denial but intention. I recycled their favorite toys into a neat bin, labeled with the same patient handwriting that had always managed birthday lists and PTA forms. Each small, tidy thing was a claim. I was still here. I was still managing this life. Complications arrived like weather, predictable and then suddenly violent. He began to notice things in the periphery and react. He called, sharp and short, insisting I was overstepping when I made arrangements. "You can't just list the house," he said once, voice flat and thin over the hum of his car. He hinted at public scenes. He mentioned lawyers as if the word alone could intimidate. There were nights he sat at the table and watched me with a look that tried to reassert the old choreography. I smelled the perfume still in the hallway and pretended it was a guest's. The more I moved, the more he tightened, as if controlling the narrative would remake the past. He tried, at one point, to change account passwords remotely. He called the bank and spoke in a voice I knew for threats thinly veiled as concern. A notification popped up on my phone. Login attempt. I watched the screen the way a surgeon watches monitors. For a second, something like panic tried to creep in. Then, I did what I had done every time I had been surprised and needed to steady. I wrote everything down. Time. Name of person I spoke with. Details. I called the bank from a number I kept for such moments and asked for a supervisor. I explained in clean sentences that items were in joint names and that I wanted verification of account changes. They obliged. There was a small bureaucratic kindness in that. The bank logged a note on the account. The world responded to documentation. A nosy neighbor found her way into the plan, in the way nosy neighbors do, curious, well-meaning, and anxious to be useful. She offered to water my plants for me while things were being sorted. She did not know the details, and I did not want her to. I accepted the watering because it bought me one less thing to worry about and because the less anyone else knew, the better. I learned to trust only those with quiet mouths and steady hands. The realtor became my ally in this way. She referred me to a title company that handled sales fast. She found a broker who specialized in discreet transactions. Her assistant carried the paperwork in a plain folder, and when the photographer came, he used angles that softened evidence, not ones that sensationalized it. They treated my life like a business to be conducted respectfully, which was all I wanted. There were moments when my courage almost slipped. A missing document, an old signed letter from the original seller that proved continuous ownership, went missing from the folder where I was sure I had placed it. I tore through boxes, closets, the attic crawlspace where we had shoved school projects during a renovation. My hands were raw with rummaging. I felt panic flare like a match struck. I stopped. I breathed. I thought of the ledger again. I texted the realtor a simple line. "Need time. Missing doc." She replied with a calm, "We'll work around it. There are ways." The way she wrote "we" soothed me more than any promise. I made allies carefully. The title officer I chose was a woman with the steady presence of someone who had seen the worst administrative storms and closed more than one house where private life had been messy. She met me at the county office and explained how easements and encumbrances worked. We spoke in legal shorthand for a while, and then she said plainly, "If both names are on the deed, you can sign. If it's a marital property situation, timing and notice matter." She did not offer moral judgments. She offered options. That was all I asked for. The map of possibility. There were pragmatic steps that felt almost ritualistic. Copies of the deed were ordered, a title search was initiated. I paid for certified copies and sat with them on the kitchen table like charms. I called the mortgage servicer to confirm payoff figures and learned the window, the days in which an escrow could close if the buyer and the title company moved promptly. Timing, I learned, was a tool. If the escrow closed while he was away or distracted, if the buyer's funds were available and the title clear, reversal would be difficult. I did not relish the thought of doing anything behind his back. I cherished the alternative, a clean, businesslike transfer that left no room for his theatrics. I prepared a backup at home. There was a small safe I had bought years ago for passports and our wills. I filled it with essentials. A few $1,000s in cash tucked into an envelope, passports, a thumb drive with copies of every important document, a list of passwords, and a small box with the children's favorite books and photos. I put 2 sets of keys in different pockets, one under a flower pot on the back porch, another at my friend's house. I labeled boxes with tiny codes only I understood. The children's favorite stuffed animal was packed last, so it would be the first thing I could hand them if the morning came when we needed to leave. The safety of preparation is underrated. It steadies your hands when urgency comes. I scheduled the open house with a precision that felt almost surgical. The realtor told me we could list it as is and still move quickly because the neighborhood was hot. We agreed on an asking price that was ambitious but honest. I took a deep breath. The photographer came early on a Tuesday and captured the house in the soft light I had coaxed into every corner. The online listing did not mention anything personal. It did not advertise heartbreak. It offered square footage, year built, and the polite, marketable phrase, well-maintained home and family neighborhood. My name was on the paperwork. The listing agent's name was on the contract. I did not advertise the truth of our life because I did not want the truth to be a commodity. When the offers came in more quickly than I expected, there was an odd sting of vindication. It sounded perversely like attention after being ignored. We negotiated with a calm that surprised me. The buyer was a young couple moving from across town, professional, polite, and willing to expedite. They wanted a quick close. That fact, more than anything, determined my decision. The escrow could be timed for the day his calendar showed a business trip stretching across the state. The plan coalesced in the neat geometry of dates. He tried to interfere. When he learned of the listing, through a mutual friend who saw the sign and told him, and then told me they'd told him, he threatened to delay closing by filing objections or raising claims. The words were a rustle in the grass, capable of making noise but not necessarily powerful. I called the title officer and asked plainly what objections could do. She explained in her steady voice that timing and documentation mattered most. If the title search was clear and the buyer's funds were in escrow, filing spurious claims would look like harassment. She reminded me to document everything and to avoid public confrontations. "We'll do this clean," she said. Clean was the only word I wanted. On the morning of signing, the house hummed with a strange, anticipatory silence. The boys were at school. The new woman and his family were out for the day, as if the world had been designed to keep us apart, while paper did its quiet business. I set the table as if it were the dining room at Sunday breakfast. A small pitcher of milk, an old linen napkin. The teacups we had kept because one of them was chipped and I could never bring myself to throw it away. The realtor arrived with a plain folder, and the title officer followed with the stack of documents that smelled faintly of toner and possibility. I sat down at the table and read every line with the same slow attention I had used when reading bedtime stories to the boys. There is a particular gravity in watching a life be reduced to clauses and signatures, but watching also gave me power. I could trace the arc of this chapter and know what would be left when it ended. The mortgage payoff sheet lay in the middle of the table, neat and readable. The buyer's earnest money had been deposited. The title company's clearance showed no liens. I signed the disclosure forms and initialed where necessary, my pen moving with steady, practiced strokes. Each signature was a small victory. Each initial reasserted ownership over my choices. He called as if to ask a simple question. his voice measured and light, but I could hear the edge. He asked what I was doing that morning. I answered, feeling the smallness of that moment like both shield and blade. "Signing papers," I said. It was true. It was a statement of agency. He did not ask what papers. He was not given time to. It is a strange thing to end a life you once shared with another by making a business transaction. That day, ink became a kind of exorcism. The escrow started the next day. The morning of closing felt like a held breath. I made coffee and forgot to sip it. The mug grew cold on the counter, a dark pool of heat that fogged when I exhaled near it. The realtor arrived with a folder under her arm and a quiet nod that said everything and nothing at once. The title officer came, with a stamped envelope and the smell of paper that carries the faint ghost of toner and new ink. The boys were at school, a concession I had arranged like a tiny kindness so they would not witness the moment adult things decided their futures. For once, the house held its breath with me. The key in my hand was ordinary and miraculous in the same moment. Metal warmed under my palm. It clicked in the lock with a sound that felt like punctuation. The front door squeaked in that small domestic way doors do when they have been opened many times and have learned to be polite. I felt the realtor's discreet hand at my back, not pushing, only steadying, and the title officer sat with a folder of documents like someone who had seen many lives fold into paper. The chair pressed into my thighs. My pulse counted small, steady beats. I read each line slowly, the names, the numbers, the clause that said, "as is." The buyer's earnest money had cleared. The title search showed no encumbrances we couldn't handle. The mortgage payoff was precise. Each signature was a small surgical cut, and I made it with a hand that did not tremble. Ink met paper, and the sound, the scratch of a pen across a page, was small and prophetic. The realtor smiled with the kind of relief that comes from work done well and secrets kept quiet when they must be. He called in the middle of signing. I could hear the artificial brightness in his voice. "Busy?" he asked, as if the question might be the brick he would throw to halt whatever momentum I had gained. "Just signing some paperwork," I said, and I did not elaborate. It was the truth. It was enough. He asked where I was. I told him. He asked what I was signing. I answered economy of words. He said something about a misunderstanding and then a soft, insistent plea. I did not give him a stage. Shortly after I signed, I walked out to the porch to let the world see me as it is. Not the spectacle he hoped for, not the drama he could broadcast. The buyer's agent had arranged for a simple sold sign to be installed that morning, so there would be no delay. It would be honest. It would be public. The sign came up like a blade of light across the lawn. Whiteboard, black type, a clean red tag that said, "Sold." I felt the moment in slow motion. The phone in my pocket buzzed. The gardener's truck idled somewhere down the street. A dog barked 2 houses over. The letters on the sign seemed to carve themselves into the air. I watched him when he saw it. He arrived at the curb like someone who had expected a different script. His foot hit the gravel and he straightened, the way people do when they walk into a room and want to look like they belong. He slowed then. A man noticing an unexpected headline. His face unclenched and then tightened, the expression moving through stages like a slow film reel. Surprise, confusion, a calculation, panic. The set of his mouth changed as he took in the sold sign. His eyes searched me as if I were the explanation, as if I had become a riddle he had not anticipated. "You sold it?" His voice was small and incredulous. It sounded like someone reading the days on a calendar and realizing the year had changed. "You can't. The words unraveled. He moved his hands as if to catch phrases that might help him patch the hole I had left. I stepped forward, and the voice I used came out cool and not unkind. "Yes, it's sold." He faltered. The sound he made was half a plea, half an accusation. "You sold our house." He held the present tense as if there was an error in the tense. His eyes landed on the realtor, then the title officer, then the sign. They traveled over the tidy, staged interior and found nothing to hang a claim on. People were gathered at the sidewalk now. Neighbors who had seen the sign go up, couples on walks pausing, the woman across the street holding a grocery bag and not making a move to intervene. There is a theater to public discovery, and the audience tends to be both merciless and fascinated. The new woman's family were there too, having returned earlier than expected perhaps, or having been in the area for some reason. Their expressions shifted as they saw what I already watched unfold on his face. Disbelief at first, then a ripple, the slow, ridiculous heat of embarrassment when a confidence is shown to be grounded on shaky soil. I watched the new woman's hand come up unconsciously to her mouth. She looked like someone whose script had been read to them one way and then altered mid-scene. The aunt's jaw clenched. The teenage cousin stared as if seeing a reality for the first time. They had brought their luggage and their certainty, and now a sign had arrived that said, in blunt type, their arrival did not constitute ownership. He tried to speak quickly, words tumbling like mismatched coins. There's been a mistake. You can't just... He looked to the realtor as if she might confess to some clerical error. The realtor shook her head with a professionalism that bordered on compassionless. All papers complete, Ernest deposited, title clear. "I'm sorry," she said, which read more as a fact than an apology. The new woman stepped forward and said his name like a question. It was the worst sort of exposure, to have someone pronounce your name and then have the world respond with an evidentiary sign. She demanded, sharp and incredulous, "What do you mean he sold it?" Her voice was loud enough now to pull neighbors closer. Questions started to bloom like weeds in the hush. The man on the porch who usually trimmed my lawn looked at me in a way that asked whether I was all right. The baker from down the street crossed his arms and offered nothing but a look that felt like a benediction. He moved suddenly into a mode I had not seen from him, a scramble to control narrative. He called someone. I could hear the phone from his pocket, and said phrases too fast to parse. He asked how this had happened and to whom he could speak. He used words like delay and claim and legal. The theater of his fluster made him look smaller, and the very act of his trying to halt the mechanism of the sale revealed how out of step he was with the facts. He had expected me to be pleased. He had planned to soothe and then reclaim. He had not planned for my methodical, quiet nudging of circumstance. The slow-motion detail that lodged in me, the image I knew friends would later describe to me with their own small vindicated relish, was the look on his face when he saw the sign and the keys change hands in that public way. His mouth found explanations and then abandoned them. He tried to reach me, to step between me and the title officer, but I let him stand there while I received the buyers in the front hall. My voice was a wall. "We agreed to terms," I said. The escrow closed. The buyers, a bright-faced couple who had been nervous and earnest and kind during visits, shook my hand and smiled. They were polite. They had no idea of the private geometry that had led to their happiness, and they deserved their new life here. The new woman began to cry, not loudly, not theatrically, but the small, stunned intake at the back of her throat was real. Her family began to voice the sort of indignation that springs from having been made to look foolish in public. The aunt spoke of needing to contact someone, of paperwork. The cousin swore softly and then quickly covered his mouth. People in our neighborhood have a way of assembling into clusters like birds on a wire. Proximity births conversation. I had prepared for humiliation without needing to taste it. I had not desired it as sport. I had desired it as remedy, a consonant action to right a private wrong. When the new woman's sister finally addressed me, voice thin with confusion, I said only, "I'm sorry this happened." It was the truth in the only tone I had to offer, compassionate and final. "It is what it is." The words were small. They carried the ballast of someone who had done the difficult work and had no appetite for spectacle. Then the twist. Small, surgical, respectable. I had the week before arranged for evidence to be delivered to certain people, not for spectacle, but for safety. A folder couriered to his sister, another sent to the HR email at his workplace, and one put in the hands of a mutual friend who kept the civic confidence required in small circles. The packages were not sent with the flourish of the outraged spouse. They were spreadsheets and copies, dates, receipts, messages, blurred where necessary. A concise note that said simply, "For your understanding." I did not do it to humiliate him. I did it so that when the truth came out, it did so in places where he could not easily paint it as fiction. It was a preemptive clearing of the record, a way to make private evidence reach places where it could be acknowledged without drama. Phones began to vibrate in pockets. Texts lit up faces like small altar candles. I saw his sister's expression shift as she read the email and then looked up at him with something that read as slow comprehension. I saw a man I had once known shrink from the comprehension in his sister's eyes in a way that felt like justice. The new woman's father walked away without his dignity. People who had been prepared to split sympathy between us began to align with the truth, either by choice or by the blunt force of documentation. There was an odd sensation then. Relief churned through the crowd. It was as if the air itself had found a new shape. People stepped away, conversation splintered, and the momentum of gossip lost its fuel. The neighbors retreated to porches. The kids at the bus stop pointed and giggled in that merciless, free way children have, unaware of complication. The buyers walked through the rooms with their palms trailing countertops like people touching a new culture. I was both present and removed. I handed over the keys, a small, ceremonial gesture made profound only by the context. The metal felt impossibly ordinary in my palm. The buyer's husband took them with a smile. The handshake that followed was firm and human. The realtor did the paperwork with a professionalism that kept prying eyes at bay. The title officer stamped a final page and slid it across like the book closing on one chapter. I locked the front door for the last time and felt the coolness of the world against my back as I left. It was not a theatrical exit. I did not throw the rings or slam drawers or shout glorious accusations. I walked like someone who had completed a long, inexorable task. I took the small box with the children's favorite books and one breakfast plate with a chip, the things that felt indispensable, and put them in the car. I had in my pocket the little safe's envelope with passports and cash. I had a list of phone numbers taped to the inside of my purse. I had, surprisingly, a lightness I had not expected. He followed me to the curb with words that trailed into the air like paper confetti. "Please," he said once, and then, more fevered, "you don't have to do this publicly. Don't make me look like a monster." The old arrogance slipped in there, the assumption that his reputation could be managed if only I consented to silence. I looked at him and felt neither loathing nor pity, as much as a calm acknowledgement. This is the man I had loved, and this is the consequence of the path he chose. The buyers drove away slowly, waving me an odd small farewell that felt like absolution. The new woman's family stood in the yard like people who had been shown a stage set and then told the actors were not who they pretended to be. The neighbors murmured and then went about whatever routines they had, mowing lawns, walking dogs, meeting for coffee. Life, in other words, resumed its ordinary rhythms. That was the strange, magnificent thing about asserting a hard right. The world around you adjusts and keeps going. The release that followed was not immediate. There was an odd numbness like the aftertaste of a meal. Tears came in the car on the drive out of the neighborhood, not the stinging, ragged sobs of grief, but small, steady releases that felt more like cleansing. The boys were relieved and sleepy and began asking, almost immediately, about the new house we would find and about whether we would take their fort with us. The practicalities of moving, which movers to call whether the new place had enough light, folded back into conversation like a balm. The texts began to come in, one by one. "I'm so proud of you," a friend wrote. "You handled it with dignity," another said. A neighbor sent a photo of the Soldi sign with a thumbs-up emoji. My sister called and said, "Come home to us if you need." The messages were small votive flames. They warmed me in a way the sale itself could not. The social aftershocks were not all comfortable. There were whispers and sideways glances, but there was also a surprising wave of support. People like to root for the measured, competent response. They resent spectacle. I had given them the former and not the latter. He tried in later days to perform a recovery of sorts. He updated social media with hashtags about new beginnings and posted photos of himself at cafes with the new woman. He sent messages that tried to reframe the narrative as our mutual transition people saw, read, and judged. Some sympathized. Some did not. I watched his attempts at promotion of his own story and felt the way one feels listening to someone trying to retell history in a way that flatters the teller. It did not matter. The legal fact remained. The deed was transferred. The buyers had moved in. My life was no longer tethered to the place that had been the stage of betrayal. We found a small rented apartment not far from the boys' school. It had a window that faced a square and a little fire escape where the youngest could hang his socks to dry. It was not the house, but it was stable and it smelled of possibility instead of resignation. I unpacked slowly. I put the children's drawings along the mini fridge and drove nails with hands that felt more competent every day. On the first night, we ate cereal in mismatched bowls and laughed at a joke one of the boys made about the moving truck being a monster. The laughter was a sound like repair. On a rainy afternoon a week later, I sat on a borrowed couch in our new place and opened a small box I had kept for myself. Inside was a child's drawing. 2 stick figures, a sun. The house, with a crooked chimney. The edges of the paper were soft from being folded and unfolded in a pocket during the hardest hours. There was a little keychain with a tiny painted heart that said Mama in a child's scrawl. I held the paper to my chest. It was small. It was everything. I did not keep his watch. I did not keep the ring. I kept this paper because it told the truth of what mattered, that we were a family regardless of an address. I folded it gently and placed it in my purse, the way you keep a map in case you forget the way you felt. Outside, the rain made puddles on the street and a neighbor opened an umbrella and walked past, giving a small, knowing nod. I smiled back. It felt like a thank you and a goodbye all at once. I had walked away free. The freedom did not look like triumphalism. It looked like the quiet gathering of our small, necessary things, the way someone stitches a life back together with hard stitches that hold. I had one small box with a few mementos and a head full of plans. We were tired, but we were moving. We were alive. Selling the house didn't destroy him. It freed me. That sentence sits with me still, quiet and stubborn. People imagine revenge as a roar. Mine was a closing of a door and the slow, deliberate packing of the life I wanted to keep. The house I loved had held our best and our worst, but taking it off the table changed the currency of everything. It didn't humiliate him into ruin. It returned agency to my hands. And that was the real victory, Light, not spectacle, but steadiness. There's a strange karma to measured action. When you refuse to be small and you refuse to beg, you teach yourself what you will accept and what you won't. That boundary is more valuable than any show of pain. I didn't set out to hurt. I set out to protect the people who mattered most. My children, their sense of safety, the dignity of our private life. In the days after, neighbors spoke in cautious tones. Some offered flowers, others offered silence. The important voices were the small ones. A text from a friend that read, "You did the right thing." The boy's small hands curled in my sleep. The way the youngest drew our new home with a big, confident sun. If there's a lesson here, it is this. Strength can be quiet. Justice can be practical. Revenge that destroys you is not revenge at all. Taking power back can be elegant, calm, and surprisingly ordinary. A series of smart, legal steps done with resolve. My children didn't remember a public spectacle. They remembered a mother who boxed up their favorite books, who answered their questions with simple truths, who held them as we walked into a new life. They learned courage, not drama. So if this story lands anywhere near your own heart, if you've ever been gaslit, blindsided, or left with the shards of someone else's choices, know this. You don't have to perform devastation to reclaim yourself. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is quietly rearrange your life so you are the one holding the map. If this revenge saga gave you that rush of justice, smash like, subscribe for more epic tales, and share your revenge story in the comments. Click the next video box for another one. I keep one small thing from that house in a shoebox. a child's drawing of a crooked little home, a chipped ceramic keychain with Mama scrawled in blue marker. It fits in my palm. I look at it when I need to remember what mattered. Not the rooms, but the people who filled them. And then I close the box and walk toward the light.